Hello and welcome to Understanding and Responding to Intrafamilial Child Sexual Abuse, which is the second recording of a series of 4 recordings. And this one is on building a picture of evidence, and my name is Susie Moore. In this recording, we're going to think about the common features and factors in families where sexual abuse has taken place. And we're also going to spend a fair bit of time looking at indicators as a way of evidencing abuse in children and young people. And that's going to look at things like behavioural and physical markers. So I've chosen this quote from Einstein because it reflects a lot of what people say in the training room, which is that they have a really strong instinct that sexual abuse might be happening in that family, or that child might be experiencing that, but they struggle to evidence it, and that we're in a world and systems where we're very much looking for quantitative evidence and disclosures where a child directly tells us exactly what they've experienced, when intuitively we know that that's unlikely, very difficult, and doesn't really work in these circumstances. So I guess what we're saying is that don't minimize the intuition, because that's a gift. And we will spend some time in this recording thinking about how we can evidence that intuitive thinking that we have, which is so amazing. So what we know is that interfamilial abuse in the family is largely hidden, and it is difficult to identify. Children have immense challenges in telling and showing people that this has happened, and it can be years and years and years before they feel comfortable to do this. The other issue that we have, which Smallbone talks about, is that quite often the abuse takes place within normal parenting activities and can be obscured by this. So, for example, it might be that the person who babysits takes advantage of the bedtime routine to groom and eventually sexually abuse this child. Or it could be bath time, or taking that child out to regularly have special one-to-one time, for example. And so what can look like very good parenting sometimes can actually be that we're looking at indicators of abuse. And that's a challenge for us. And also because we're groomed by people who perpetrate these types of abuse as much as the child. So in our responding to these concerns, what the CSA Centre has said, the Child Sexual Abuse Centre, is that we put too much responsibility on children to recognise that they're being abused, and then find somebody that they trust who they feel isn't going to be horrified or not believe them, and talk about what's happened to them. Not only is this, an incredibly heavy burden of responsibility to put on a child, but it's also very unrealistic. And they can't and shouldn't be the only witness to the harm that they experience. Children shouldn't have to live and bear this burden all on their own, and it's our job to find ways to engage with children and enable them to be able to tell us or show us if that's what they choose to do. And so you can read more about that in the CSA Centre, in the Don't Wait for Them to Tell Us, Recognise and Responding to Signs of Sexual Abuse article. In the latest government strategy, the 2021 strategy, it very clearly states it's not the responsibility of a child to stop sexual abuse, and it's never a child's fault if they are targeted. So how do you currently pick up on signs of child sexual abuse in families? What are the ways that you currently do that? We have some research from the Research in Practice Toolkit, which have looked at what characteristics are commonly seen in families. And so they've highlighted that there might be rigid roles between different family members, There might be a lot of stress, which could be financial. There's dysfunction that goes with that stress, and that they've also noted that children are often unwanted from that pregnancy. Similarly, with the risk factors, their focus on there being some neglect, unavailability of parents, so maybe some fractured or challenged attachment relationships, that there's a vulnerability around, the challenge of being a single parent or having a step parent, potentially for some families. And they've also mentioned a mother with an unresolved history of sexual abuse herself. And that, I guess, is around that if you haven't necessarily accepted and recognised your own history, then you're less likely to see that vulnerability and the grooming signs within your own children, because you haven't recognised and understood what happened to you in the first place. So that can kind of give people a blind spot sometimes. And because they've been groomed once already, it makes them more vulnerable potentially to being groomed again a second time. So some more family characteristics, and these have come from Cynthia Cross and Tower's book, that there was a common theme of family violence. 1 in 5 cases there was family violence featuring in that context. Hostile, dominating family communication, substance abuse, in particular alcohol, much more so than other types of substances. There were mental health problems in the families, poor boundaries, maybe the parents were behaving more like friends than parents, and that family was socially isolated, either because they were ostracised from the community or they had chosen to not be a part of the community. So the complexity of victim identification. Sexual behaviours are frequently couched in the context of play. So when these things happen, they're often done through games, and consequently young victims are likely to find these activities pleasurable. So somebody, a child or an adult, gives that child a lot of attention, and maybe because it's done in a way in which is a very natural way for children to enjoy games, like being tickled or chased, or doing lots of physical activity together. When the sexual abuse is interwoven into that, it's understandable that that is all mixed up with pleasurable activities that that person has with that child from the child's perspective. But consequently, that makes it really difficult for the child to see themselves as a victim, and particularly in sibling relationships where there is a dynamic that's very special. So a same generation special relationship with the offender could be welcomed by the younger sibling. So because of the things that we've talked about in the family, if there's, dominating communication, rigid roles, maybe violence, one child is looking after the other child in that sense and protecting them, they may also be the child that sexually abuses them. And so it's really difficult for the child who's the victim in this to see that that's abusive, because they need that relationship, and the abuse happens in the context of play. Cross and Tower invites us to think about sibling abuse in terms of consent. So there's a lack of consent from one sibling, which means that there's likely to be coercion or force used to get that sibling's compliance. And there's often a difference of power and resources available to each child. In a recent community care podcast, they talk about in sibling abuse, it tends to go on for a lot longer than non-sibling based abuse. There's usually penetration, and in their research, there was frequently an age difference of 5 years plus. Here we have a useful tool from Hackett. Now this tool helps us think about sexual behaviours in a continuum. So we have normal,
expected, developmentally appropriate, consensual, shared decision making on one end of the spectrum, and then violent on the other, where the abuse is physically and sexually violent, highly intrusive. There's instrumental violence, which is psychologically, sexually arousing to the perpetrator and has elements of sadism in it. So when we think about it across this continuum, we can help use the appropriate language and frame it within the level of safeguarding response that we need. So is it inappropriate? Is it something that we could manage within the family context, where you know, a little bit of education or boundaries might need to be addressed? Or is it abusive? You know, is there a significant misuse of power, coercion, with maybe some level of violence? So there's a lot more detail on this tool if you want to go and have a look at it, and it's from Hackett.
So Mary, for example, from the Truth Project, said that her brother began abusing her when she was 10, and her brother said, "This is what big brothers do, I'll show you how to do it." They explained sex. And at that time, you know, she adored her brother, she trusted him, and didn't question it. But that abuse escalated into a situation where he was regularly raping her. And it wasn't until she got to secondary school that she realised what was actually happening because of how he'd presented it. There are a lot of stories like Mary's on the Truth Project if you're interested in having a read of people's experiences. And again, emotionally look after yourselves if you choose to do this, because some of them are quite harrowing to read, the things that people have gone through, but also quite humbling that people get through those experiences and come out the other end.
Here, Hackett provides us with another useful resource, the sexual behaviours continuum for siblings, and he's showing us that we can start to think about them in sort of 3 different ways. So normative sexual interaction, inappropriate or problematic, and what then we can define as sibling sexual abuse. And that is that it's behaviour that causes sexual, physical and emotional harm, including sexually abusive behaviour, which involves violence, coercion or force. So similar to Cynthia Crossan Tower. And the normative would be that there's behaviour between young siblings that exists within what we would expect developmentally for those particular children.
I've attached some resources here for you to look at. You can contact Stop It Now and get copies of these. They're quite useful for talking to families. There's one on sexual development, there's a family safety plan, there's one on kind of helping recognise signs of abuse from adults towards children. So if you go on the website, it's part of Lucy Faithfull Foundation Trust, you can select which of these you want to have copies of, and I think there's a very small charge, or maybe you can have one set free. But anyway, it's well worth doing, and it gives you some resources to work with families.
So RIP have a useful tool, Research and Practice, called Interfamilial Child Sexual Abuse, Risk Factors, Indicators and Protective Factors. It's a really good document to get if you haven't already got it. But in that they have this table of vulnerabilities. So they've looked at the research, and these things are the common themes that kept coming out around the vulnerabilities of families where there was interfamilial sexual abuse. Poor attachments within the families was one of those things, which might have been related to the mental health issues or the substance abuse, alcohol misuse, or histories of trauma within the parents. And again, we mentioned this earlier, it could be through parental absence because of work commitments. History of maternal sexual abuse, as we mentioned earlier. Maybe the children or the adults have disability. Maybe their communication is poor. It might be that they're homeschooled and therefore isolated. That there was a lack of sex education for the children and the family. Domestic abuse was prevalent. A history of abuse within that family generally, and social isolation. And that's from Allnock in 2018. So when we're thinking about our assessments, one of the things that we can look at are what are the family vulnerabilities, and do we see these things in the families that we're working with. So not only are we looking at family vulnerabilities, though, we're also looking at the behaviour of the adults as well as the behaviour of the children. So some of the things that we might want to consider are, is there one particular person who controls the child's privacy, personal matters and decision making? And if so, why is that? What does the adult gain from having that control over the child? Is there a lot of physical affection when the child seems to not appreciate it? Is there over and above amounts of kissing or hugging or wrestling? And how does the child seem to feel about this? Is there an over interest in the sexual development of a child, encouraging sexual discussion, asking lots of questions about the child's sexual development? Do they always have to have time alone with the child with no interruptions? One woman in the Truth Project talks about how her granddad used to take her on long car journeys on her own, and then he would abuse her in the garage afterwards. Is this an adult where they seem to have much better relationships and are much more comfortable in the presence of children than adults, and don't seem to be interested in spending time with people their own age? And we've seen this in some of the lives of some of the celebrities who we now know were prolific sex offenders. Do they regularly offer to babysit, take children out on their own? One of the people that I worked with, one of the children I supported, the man who abused him used to take him fishing as a special treat regularly once a week, and that's ultimately where he abused him, when they were fishing. He was given gifts, for example. He was given new trainers, bought school books because his parents were struggling financially, and so this person who was grooming him would buy him things and take him out when his dad couldn't. There's other examples of people saying that the person who abused them used to walk in on them a lot at inappropriate times when we were in the bathroom, or that they would be naked around them, and that's around normalising that kind of sexual behaviour. Do they make one child feel the favourite? Do they make one of the children in the family seem special compared to the others? Or are they demonising a particular child? So some of these things maybe you're seeing in the families where there are concerns, and again that helps build a picture of evidence. And so lastly, what are the indicators? Again, in this same piece of research, there's a really useful tool, but there's also a really useful one from Cynthia Cross and Tower, which you will have in your handbooks, which will have been sent to you as well. And so one of the obvious, easier things to evidence are physical injuries. So it might be that you have a child who seems to be uncomfortable sitting down, or in the sexual health clinic or the GP discovers that there's bleeding, for example, or problems urinating or discharge. And it's important to not dismiss those things, because combined with other parts of evidence, they can be really key to finding out what's happened. It might be that the child has a urinary tract infection, or repeated infections, or they talk about being sore. Maybe they've got warts or sexually transmitted infections or pregnancies. They could be physical signs of physical abuse like scratches or bites. Or it may be that the child is physically injuring themselves, maybe as a way of coping. So perhaps they're very controlling about their own eating, maybe they're using substances a lot. Maybe they're self-harming or self-mutilating. Then there are the psychosomatic functional disorders. So these are the things that are related to the abuse but are not a direct link to the abuse. So, for example, one of the ways that a child might take control of their life when they are very much out of control with the abuse is to very much withdraw, to just refuse to take part in any aspect of life. Maybe they disassociate so that there are times when you feel like they're just not present emotionally. Their body is there, but they don't seem emotionally present. Some children have what looks like an epileptic seizure, but actually it's a dissociative state which is related to the trauma. And so if we think that a child is having an epileptic seizure, for example, we need to be sure that they've been diagnosed with epilepsy and not just assume that that's what it is. Many children suffer from irritable bowel syndrome. A lot of stress is located in our stomachs. And if we're in a state of fight or flight all the time, then that takes its toll on our digestive system because it's always overactive. So consequently, children might talk of a stomachache a lot or a headache. So they're related to the abuse, but they're not direct result of the abuse. And then drug and alcohol misuse, again, commonly seen in the behaviour of people with histories of sexual abuse. As a drugs worker, it got to the point where I would almost expect my clients, people who use the service, to say that this was part of their history because it was so common in that client group. Some more functional disorders, as we've said, headaches, migraines, the smearing of faeces, children who've been toilet trained still soiling their clothes, for example. Other types of eating disorders, including overeating. Some children talked about wanting to make themselves unattractive, and so they just kept eating in the hope that that person would leave them alone. Or it might be that a child wets themselves in a stressful situation. And again, that's a perfectly normal trauma response, and hopefully would be seen as such and could be part of the evidence base for the abuse. So emotionally, we might see children who have sleeping problems, mood swings, have fears about people or places, who maybe seem distracted or have other types of post-traumatic stress disorder. They might fear intimacy or be over-intimate. You might see children regressing to some much younger behaviours like sucking their thumb. Or you might recognise that they find their own bodies repulsive or see themselves as repulsive and shameful. And again, we need to ask ourselves why. So some of the behaviours that we might see, there might be sexualised behaviours, games, sexual play with other children. There might be excessive masturbation, aggression or violence, unusual personal hygiene. So many things that are quite key to evidencing sexual abuse and would be really unusual to see in children who hadn't been abused. There's also that concept of sexual promiscuity that we hear about in the training room. Oh, that child's promiscuous, so they have a lot of partners. And thinking about what that means and why that is for that child. Because it's unlikely to be that they really enjoy sex. It's much more likely to be that sex is a way that they have been shown that love is shown through sex or needs are met through sex, and consequently maybe that child has ideas about themselves and their body and sex, which then translate in behaviours of having sex or encouraging sex with other children. Maybe those children leave clues to have discussions around sex. Maybe we see that they have new toys or gifts. Maybe they say things that make us think, oh, where did you hear that word from? Or that's an unusually sexualized term for a child. Or maybe that's a child that's running away, that's persistently missing from home. So there are lots of indicators that we can think about. And then when we're presenting our evidence or hypothesizing about, is this interfamilial sexual abuse or not, is this one of the hypotheses that we can work with, we can think about what are the vulnerabilities, what are the indicators, what has the child said or done, what are they drawing, how are they talking about different people in their family. And then with that combination, we can start to think about, is this a valid hypothesis that we can go down? So your personal reflection for this recording is, there's all this evidence available, what gets in the way of us using it? And how can we personally get around those barriers that we have identified?
We've come to the end of this session, so thank you for listening, and log in to your next live session at the time that I've allocated, and we'll do some more case study work and discussion. Thanks, everybody.